"Mom, did you ever spend the money Grandpa left you?" my son asked during Thanksgiving dinner. The room went silent. My daughter-in-law dropped her wine glass, and for the first time in years, I realized someone in my family had been lying to me. I always believed Thanksgiving was supposed to feel warm, safe. The kind of holiday where the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled every corner of the house and made old memories feel alive again. That year, the snow had started early in Ohio. Thin white flakes drifted past the kitchen windows while I stood over the stove basting the turkey for the third time. The house smelled like sage stuffing and sweet potatoes, but underneath it all lingered the cold scent of a home that had become too quiet after my husband died. Daniel had been gone for almost 4 years, yet some mornings I still reached for his side of the bed before remembering there was nobody there. At 68, I had gotten used to silence. I had learned how to make 1 cup of coffee instead of 2, how to keep the thermostat at 62 degrees to save money, how to fold the same winter coat over my arms every morning because buying a new one felt irresponsible. Still, Thanksgiving mattered to me. It was one of the few times Ethan and Vanessa came to visit. I spent nearly 2 days preparing dinner. I polished the silverware Daniel's mother had given us when we got married. I used the good china, even though Vanessa once said it looked outdated. I even baked Ethan's favorite pecan pie from scratch, the same recipe I had used every Thanksgiving since he was 10 years old. By 4 in the afternoon, their SUV finally pulled into the driveway. Ethan stepped out first, tall like his father, wearing a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Vanessa followed behind him in cream-colored boots with tiny gold buckles. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect smile. She hugged me lightly without really touching me. "The house smells amazing, Eleanor," she said in that polished voice she used whenever she wanted to sound kind. Ethan kissed my cheek quickly before checking his phone. "Traffic was terrible," he muttered. During dinner, I tried to keep the conversation pleasant. I asked about Ethan's consulting business. Vanessa talked about a ski trip they were planning in Colorado after Christmas. I nodded and smiled while quietly calculating whether I could afford another refill of my blood pressure medication before the end of the month. Then dessert came. Ethan leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie while I sliced the pecan pie. "You know," he said casually, "Dad would have been happy seeing you enjoy everything he left behind." My hand paused midair. Everything he left behind. Ethan frowned slightly. "The trust fund, Mom. The monthly payments. Didn't Grandpa ever tell you about any of it?" The knife nearly slipped from my fingers. "What payments?" Across the table, Vanessa went completely still. Her smile disappeared so quickly it was like watching a light switch turn off. Ethan looked confused. "The trust Dad set up before he died. He told me he arranged for you to receive $3,000 every month." I stared at him. $3,000 a month. My chest tightened so suddenly I could barely breathe. For winters of clipping coupons. For years of choosing generic medication over groceries. For years of pretending I was managing fine because I didn't want my son to worry about me. Vanessa suddenly reached for her wine glass too fast. It slipped from her hand and shattered across the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And in that terrible silence, I realized my husband had hidden something from me for years. Or worse, someone else had hidden it after he died. Vanessa apologized for the broken glass 3 separate times before they left that night, but her voice sounded too careful, too rehearsed. Ethan kept insisting there had to be some misunderstanding. He even offered to help me call the bank in the morning, but I told him I was tired and needed rest. That part was true. I had never felt exhaustion settle into my bones the way it did that night. After they drove away, I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the old refrigerator hum softly against the silence. Half the pecan pie still sat, untouched on the counter. Daniel used to sneak a slice before bed every Thanksgiving. He always claimed pie tasted better after midnight. I slowly wrapped the leftovers in foil, my hands trembling so badly that I tore the edge twice. Then I noticed the heating vent rattling near the dining room window. Cold air slipped through the old frame. I walked over and pulled the curtains shut tighter, but the draft remained. The house suddenly felt older than it ever had before. Older and full of things I no longer understood. I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, I sat in Daniel's recliner wrapped in a faded blue blanket and stared at the grandfather clock near the fireplace. Every tick sounded louder than usual. My mind kept replaying Ethan's words. $3,000 a month. Daniel had always handled the finances during our marriage. Not because he controlled me, but because he enjoyed numbers and paperwork while I preferred gardening and teaching piano lessons at church. After he passed away, Ethan and Vanessa stepped in quickly. Too quickly, I realized now. Vanessa offered to organize the paperwork after the funeral because I was grieving. She said legal documents could overwhelm me. At the time, I had been grateful. I remembered sitting at this same dining table 4 years earlier while condolence casseroles filled the refrigerator and sympathy cards covered the counter. Vanessa had sorted stacks of envelopes into neat piles while Ethan answered phone calls from relatives. "Do not stress about bills right now," she had told me gently. Daniel prepared everything before he passed. I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. The next morning, snow covered the driveway in a thin white layer. I put on my old wool coat and drove downtown to the bank branch Daniel had used for nearly 30 years. My hands stayed tight around the steering wheel the entire drive. I kept hoping Ethan had simply misunderstood something. Maybe Daniel had intended to create a trust, but never finalized it. Maybe there had been insurance money Ethan confused with investments. Maybe I was letting grief and suspicion poison my thinking. But deep down, something colder had already started settling inside me. The bank lobby smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Christmas decorations hung near the teller windows, even though Thanksgiving had only passed the night before. A young employee greeted me politely and asked how he could help. When I explained that I wanted information about any trusts connected to my late husband's name, his expression changed almost immediately. "One moment, Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly. He disappeared into a back office for several minutes before returning with a woman in a gray blazer and silver glasses. She introduced herself as Karen from Estate Services. The moment she sat across from me, I knew something was wrong. She folded her hands carefully before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "according to our records, monthly distributions from the Whitmore Family Trust have been active for the last 46 months. I stared at her without blinking. "Active?" She nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. The payments have been deposited electronically into the account assigned by the trust administrator." My throat tightened. "Who is the administrator?" Karen looked down at the screen for only a second before answering. "Vanessa Whitmore." For a few seconds, I forgot how to breathe. The bank office suddenly felt too warm, too small, like the walls had started closing around me. Karen continued speaking in a calm, professional voice, but her words blurred together after I heard Vanessa's name. I stared at the tiny silver necklace resting against Karen's collarbone just to keep myself steady. "Mrs. Whitmore," she asked softly, "would you like some water?" I shook my head. My hands rested motionless in my lap, but inside me something had begun to crack open. 46 months. Almost 4 years. Every winter morning, I had wrapped myself in blankets because I was afraid to turn the heat above 62 degrees. Every grocery trip where I quietly put things back on the shelf after checking my bank balance. Every night, I told myself not to become a burden to my son. And all that time, money Daniel intended for me had been flowing somewhere else. Karen slid a folder gently across the desk. "These are the distribution records attached to the trust." I opened it slowly. The pages smelled faintly of printer ink. Month after month appeared in neat rows across the statements. $3,000 transferred regularly into an account ending in 4421. I recognized those last 4 numbers immediately. Vanessa once used that same account to order dinner while we were visiting them in Chicago. My stomach tightened so hard it hurt. Did my husband assign her as administrator himself? I asked quietly. Karen hesitated. According to the updated filing, yes. Updated filing. The phrase echoed in my mind. Updated, not original. Karen must have noticed something in my expression because her voice became gentler. "Mrs. Whitmore, there were modifications submitted 6 weeks after your husband passed away. 6 weeks after Daniel died. I could barely remember my own name some mornings. I had spent most days sitting in the living room clutching sympathy cards while casseroles spoiled untouched in the refrigerator. Vanessa had handled everything back then. She scheduled appointments, answered legal calls, organized paperwork. She even drove me to the cemetery because Ethan was too emotional to drive himself. I remembered thanking her. I remembered telling church friends how lucky I was to have such a caring daughter-in-law. The memory made my face burn with shame. Karen pointed carefully to one of the forms. This authorization transferred management authority to Vanessa Whitmore while preserving your beneficiary status. I frowned, but I never received anything. Karen looked genuinely confused now. She turned the monitor slightly toward herself and clicked through several files before stopping. According to these notes, monthly deposits were redirected at the request of the trust administrator due to concerns about your financial competency. The room went silent again. Financial competency. I repeated the words slowly inside my head as if they belonged to someone else. Daniel used to joke that I balanced our checkbook more accurately than the bank itself. I taught piano lessons for 30 years. I managed a household, raised a son, paid taxes, organized school fundraisers, and cared for my husband through chemotherapy appointments before he died. Yet somehow, on paper, I had become incompetent. My chest ached, but not from sadness anymore. This felt colder, sharper, like finally touching the edge of a blade after years of only sensing its shadow. Karen lowered her voice. Mrs. Whitmore, if you did not authorize these changes personally, you may want to speak with an attorney. I nodded slowly without answering. Outside the office window, snow drifted softly across the parking lot. People walked past carrying shopping bags and coffee cups, living ordinary lives while mine quietly rearranged itself piece by piece. Then Karen said something that made the blood drain from my face completely. There is one more thing, she said carefully. Your husband left a handwritten note attached to the original trust documents. It appears the note was never collected after his death. Karen left the office briefly and returned carrying a thin manila envelope with slightly bent corners. She handled it carefully, almost respectfully, before placing it in front of me on the desk. This was attached to the original trust paperwork, she explained softly. It was marked for you personally. My name appeared on the front in Daniel's handwriting. Just seeing those familiar, uneven letters nearly broke something inside me. Daniel always pressed too hard with his pen. Even grocery lists looked permanent when he wrote them. For a moment, I could not bring myself to touch the envelope. My fingers hovered over it while memories rose quietly to the surface. Daniel sitting at the kitchen table reading the Sunday paper with his glasses low on his nose. Daniel humming old Frank Sinatra songs while repairing cabinet doors in the garage. Daniel squeezing my hand during chemotherapy treatments even when he was the one in pain. He had always been steady, solid, the kind of man who noticed when I was cold before I said a word. I finally opened the envelope carefully along the edge. Inside was a single folded sheet of cream-colored paper. The letter was short, much shorter than I expected. Eleanor, if you are reading this, something did not happen the way I intended. Please trust documents, not explanations. There are things I could not say openly before my surgery. If certain changes appear after my death, speak to Margaret Doyle before trusting anyone else, especially when money becomes involved. I read the note twice, then a third time, especially when money becomes involved. Daniel had underlined those words so deeply the pen nearly tore through the paper. A strange heaviness settled over me. Not panic anymore, not confusion. This felt different, like slowly realizing the house you lived in for years had hidden cracks behind the walls all along. Who is Margaret Doyle? Karen asked gently. An attorney, I answered automatically. She handled our house closing nearly 20 years ago. I had not heard her name in over a decade. Daniel trusted very few people when it came to finances, but he always trusted Margaret. I remembered them sitting together at our dining room table years ago discussing retirement plans while Vanessa wandered through the kitchen pretending not to listen. Back then, Ethan had only been dating her for a few months. She was charming, quiet, polished in a way that made everyone immediately comfortable around her. Daniel once told me he admired how ambitious she seemed. Looking back now, I wondered when his opinion changed, or if he noticed something before any of us did. I folded the letter slowly and slipped it back into the envelope. My wedding ring caught the overhead light as my hand moved. Daniel used to joke that I never took it off because I was afraid another man might steal me away. The memory almost made me smile. Almost. Karen printed several additional pages for me before I left the office. Transaction records, authorization forms, copies of signatures. Vanessa's name appeared everywhere. Clean, precise, organized. Too organized. Outside, the afternoon sky had darkened into heavy gray clouds. Snow covered the sidewalks in uneven slush as I walked carefully back to my car. My knees ached from the cold. The envelope rested quietly in my purse beside my gloves. During the drive home, I began noticing things I had ignored for years. Vanessa always insisted on collecting the mail whenever they visited. She encouraged Ethan to switch Daniel's old filing cabinet into storage because it looked outdated. She answered legal questions before Ethan had the chance to speak. Even at the funeral, she stood beside me constantly, never leaving me alone long enough to think clearly. At the time, I called it kindness. Now it looked more like supervision. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house stood silent beneath a thin layer of snow. For years that silence had felt lonely. That afternoon, for the first time, it felt watchful. That evening I did something I had not done since Daniel passed away. I unlocked the door to his workshop in the garage. For nearly 4 years, I had avoided that room completely. At first, the grief felt too sharp. Later, life simply became smaller and quieter until certain doors inside the house stopped existing in my mind. The overhead light flickered weakly when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of sawdust, machine oil, and old cedar wood. Daniel used to spend hours in there repairing furniture or building birdhouses he never actually finished. Half-completed projects still rested on the shelves exactly where he left them. A wooden cabinet without handles. Sandpaper stacked neatly beside jars of screws. His old red thermos sitting near the workbench like he might return any minute to pick it up. I stood there silently for a long time with my coat still on. Then I noticed something strange. One drawer in the workbench looked cleaner than the others. The brass handle had fewer scratches around it, as though it had been opened more recently. My pulse slowed into that cold, careful rhythm I had started feeling ever since Thanksgiving dinner. I pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside were old receipts, measuring tape, flashlight batteries, and beneath them all, a small black key taped under the back corner. I froze. Daniel used to hide spare keys everywhere. Under flower pots, inside cereal boxes, behind framed photographs. He once told Ethan that a man should always have one secret place nobody thinks to check. My eyes moved instinctively toward the tall green filing cabinet in the corner of the workshop. Vanessa had suggested moving that cabinet into storage after Daniel died because she claimed the rusted drawers looked ugly. Somehow, I had forgotten all about it. The cabinet groaned softly when I opened the bottom drawer. Inside were old insurance folders, tax returns, and stacks of carefully labeled paperwork tied together with faded rubber bands. Then I saw it. A small metal lockbox tucked behind the files. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the black key. The lock clicked open almost immediately. Inside rested several envelopes, a digital voice recorder, and a yellow legal pad covered in Daniel's handwriting. I picked up the recorder first. Dust coated the plastic surface. A small white sticker on the back read, November 14th. 6 days before his surgery. My throat tightened. I pressed play. Static crackled softly before Daniel's voice filled the workshop. Older, tired, but unmistakably him. If you are hearing this, Ellie, then something probably went wrong. I stopped breathing. He coughed quietly before continuing. I did not want to scare you before surgery, but there are financial documents you need to review carefully if I do not make it home. My knees weakened enough that I sat down slowly on the wooden stool beside the workbench. Outside, wind rattled softly against the garage door. Vanessa has been asking unusual questions about the trust, Daniel continued. Too many questions. I might be wrong. God knows I hope I am wrong. But if changes happen after my death, promise me you will speak to Margaret before signing anything. I stared at the recorder in my hand while cold spread slowly across my skin. Daniel knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to worry. Enough to leave warnings hidden behind locked drawers and old paperwork. The recording continued for another minute, mostly instructions about account numbers and legal contacts. But one sentence stayed lodged deep inside me. Ethan trusts too easily when people sound confident. I closed my eyes after the recorder clicked off. Ethan had always been gentle. Even as a child, he believed excuses before facts. If a classmate lied, Ethan defended them. If a salesman pressured him, he apologized while handing over his credit card. Daniel used to call it kindness. Sitting there alone in the workshop, I finally understood how dangerous kindness could become in the wrong hands. Then I opened the first envelope inside the lockbox and saw copies of trust documents with signatures that did not look entirely like mine. I carried the documents into the house just after sunset. Snow tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the old furnace struggled to warm the living room. For years I had hated how loud that furnace sounded. That night, the noise comforted me. It reminded me I was still here, still thinking clearly, still capable of understanding what had happened to my own life. I spread the papers carefully across the dining room table, where we had eaten Thanksgiving dinner only 2 nights earlier. The same table where Ethan looked confused and Vanessa dropped her wine glass. Under the yellow light overhead, the signatures became easier to examine. My name appeared several times on amendment forms connected to the trust. Eleanor Whitmore. The letters looked close enough to mine at first glance, but not completely. The loops were too narrow, the pressure too even. Daniel used to tease me because my handwriting always slanted upward when I was tired. These signatures stayed perfectly straight, almost practiced. I opened another envelope from the lockbox and found photocopies of older legal documents with authentic samples of my signature from years earlier. Daniel had organized everything carefully. Side by side, the differences became obvious. My chest tightened again, but this time anger slipped quietly beneath the fear. Not explosive anger. Something colder. Something patient. I sat there for nearly an hour comparing papers while the coffee beside me slowly turned cold. Outside, headlights occasionally moved across the street as neighbors returned home from holiday shopping. Normal lives continued all around me while mine unraveled page by page. Then I noticed a smaller receipt paperclip behind one of the amendment forms. A notary appointment, dated 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral. My stomach turned. I remembered that day immediately. Vanessa had driven me to what she called routine estate paperwork. I had been exhausted from grief and barely sleeping. She handed me documents one at a time and pointed where I needed to sign. I never fully read them. At one point, I even remember apologizing for being slow because my eyes kept filling with tears whenever I saw Daniel's name. Vanessa squeezed my shoulder gently and told me not to worry. "I am handling everything for you," she said. The memory hit me so hard I had to close my eyes. She had not handled things for me. She had handled them around me. My gaze drifted toward the framed family photograph sitting on the china cabinet nearby. It was taken 6 Christmases ago before Daniel became sick. Ethan stood behind me smiling with one arm around Vanessa while she leaned perfectly into his shoulder wearing a cream-colored sweater and pearl earrings. Back then, I thought she looked elegant, refined, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to build a beautiful life. Daniel looked proud in that photo, proud of his son, proud of the family we created. I wondered what he would think now if he could see his trust papers spread across the table beside forged signatures and hidden account transfers. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed softly beside the sugar bowl. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Mom." His voice sounded uneasy. "Vanessa feels terrible about Thanksgiving. She thinks she upset you." I looked down at the forged documents in front of me. "Did she?" Silence filled the line briefly. Then Ethan sighed. "She is worried you misunderstood what I said about Dad's trust." There it was. Not concern for me. Concern about what I knew. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "Ethan," I asked quietly, "when your father died, did you ever personally review the trust paperwork?" Another silence. Longer this time. "Vanessa handled most of that stuff," he admitted finally. "You know I am terrible with legal documents." I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel had been right. Ethan trusted confidence more than facts. "Mom," he asked again softly, "is everything okay?" I looked toward the dark reflection of myself in the dining room window. I barely recognized the woman staring back anymore. "No," I answered calmly, "but I think it finally will be." The next morning I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. For years grief had made my body heavy and slow, but now something else had replaced it. Clarity. The kind that arrives quietly after denial finally runs out of places to hide. I stood in the kitchen wearing Daniel's old flannel robe while coffee brewed beside the window. Snow covered the backyard in smooth, untouched white. The bird feeder Daniel built years ago leaned slightly to one side after last winter's storm, but the cardinals still came every morning. Daniel used to say birds trusted consistency more than beauty. I finally understood what he meant. Vanessa had never relied on love alone. She relied on routine, control, predictability. She counted on everyone staying too distracted or too polite to ask questions. I carried my coffee into the dining room where the trust documents still covered the table. The sight no longer shocked me. Instead, I began organizing everything into neat folders the way Daniel used to. Bank statements in one pile, signature comparisons in another, notes from the voice recorder beside the legal amendments. By 8:30, I had created a timeline stretching nearly 4 years. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Transfers increased whenever Ethan received work bonuses. Expensive purchases appeared shortly after larger withdrawals from the trust account. Luxury hotel charges, airline tickets, furniture stores. I recognized one transaction immediately. A lakeside vacation rental in Michigan. Vanessa once told me Ethan surprised her with that anniversary trip using money he earned from a consulting contract. I remembered smiling when she showed me the photographs. Sunset dinners beside the water. White robes embroidered with the resort logo. Meanwhile, during that same month, I had quietly canceled a dental appointment because my insurance deductible felt too expensive. The realization should have broken me. Instead, it hardened something inside me into perfect stillness. Around noon, I called Margaret Doyle's office. A young receptionist answered and informed me Margaret was semi-retired now, but still accepted select private clients. The moment I mentioned Daniel Whitmore's name, the woman paused. "Please hold one moment, Mrs. Whitmore." Less than 30 seconds later, another voice came onto the line. Older, calm, sharp. "Eleanor," Margaret said softly. "I have been wondering when you might finally call me." I sat down slowly at the table. "You knew?" "Not everything," she answered carefully, "but enough to stay worried." We arranged to meet the following afternoon at her office downtown. Before hanging up, Margaret asked one question that lingered with me long after the call ended. "Has Vanessa realized you know about the trust yet?" I looked toward the kitchen where my cell phone rested charging beside the fruit bowl. 3 unread text messages from Ethan already waited on the screen. Vanessa had not contacted me directly once since Thanksgiving. Not once. "I do not think so," I answered quietly. "Good," Margaret replied immediately. "Keep it that way for now." After the call ended, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside rested old family albums, Christmas ornaments, and the small velvet jewelry box Daniel gave me on our 40th anniversary. Beneath those things sat my personal checkbook and a thin envelope containing emergency cash I had slowly saved over the years. Not because Daniel hid money from me, because women my age learned long ago that survival sometimes depended on having something private. I counted the bills carefully. $840. Enough to retain an attorney temporarily, if necessary. I placed the envelope into my purse beside Daniel's handwritten letter. Then I did something I had not done since before his illness began. I looked directly at myself in the bedroom mirror for a long time. The woman staring back looked older than she once had. Fine lines around the mouth, silver hair at the temples, tired eyes. But underneath the exhaustion, something unfamiliar had returned. Not innocence, not softness, awareness. And for the first time in years, I realized I was no longer waiting for someone else to protect me. Margaret Doyle's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown above a pharmacy and a closed travel agency. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that belonged to places where people still trusted signed documents more than digital passwords. Margaret herself looked older than I remembered, but sharper somehow. Her silver hair was cut neatly above her shoulders, and she wore dark glasses attached to a thin gold chain around her neck. The moment I stepped inside her office, she stood and hugged me tightly without saying a word. That simple kindness nearly unraveled me more than everything else had. "Sit down, Eleanor," she said gently, "and bring everything you found." For the next hour, I laid the papers across her conference table while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Margaret studied each document carefully, occasionally making small notes with a fountain pen. She listened to portions of Daniel's voice recording twice without interrupting. The only sound in the room came from the ticking wall clock behind her desk. Finally, she removed her glasses and leaned back slowly in her chair. "Your husband suspected financial manipulation before his surgery," she said quietly. "But I do not think he realized how far it would go." I stared at the forged signatures resting beneath her hand. Can they really do this? Margaret's expression hardened slightly. People can do many things when grief creates confusion and trust replaces verification. She pointed toward one amendment form. This signature would never survive formal scrutiny. But most families never challenge these situations because embarrassment keeps them silent. Embarrassment. The word settled heavily inside me because it was true. A part of me already felt ashamed for not noticing sooner. Ashamed for trusting too completely. Margaret must have seen something change in my face because her voice softened again. Eleanor, this was calculated. You were grieving. Vulnerable people are easier to redirect. Redirect. Such a polite word for theft. Margaret opened a thick legal folder from her desk drawer and slid several printed records toward me. I already requested preliminary banking disclosures this morning after your call yesterday. I blinked in surprise. You moved that quickly? Daniel once helped my husband through bankruptcy 25 years ago, she answered simply. I owe him. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Even now, years after his death, Daniel was still protecting me through the loyalty he left behind in other people. Margaret tapped one transaction record near the bottom of the page. This concerns me most. I looked closer. Large withdrawals had been moved from the trust into a separate investment account under Vanessa's management company. Nearly $200,000 over 4 years. My vision blurred slightly. Ethan knew about this? Margaret sighed quietly. Based on the account permissions, I suspect Ethan signed documents without fully understanding them. Vanessa appears to have maintained primary control. That sounded exactly like my son. Trusting, distracted, eager to avoid conflict. I suddenly remembered a dinner nearly 3 years earlier when Ethan joked about never reading contracts because Vanessa handled all the boring details for him. Everyone laughed at the time. Even Daniel smiled politely, though now I wondered what he had truly been thinking behind that expression. Margaret folded her hands carefully. I need you to understand something important before we continue. I nodded silently. Once Vanessa realizes you are investigating this formally, her behavior may change quickly. People who depend on control rarely surrender it calmly. I looked down at the wedding ring still resting on my hand. I do not want revenge, I said quietly. Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on mine. No, she replied softly. You want the truth restored. There is a difference. Outside the office window, church bells rang faintly somewhere downtown. For slow chimes drifting through the snowy afternoon. Margaret gathered the papers into organized stacks before speaking again. Do not confront them yet, she warned. Let them believe nothing has changed. I nodded once. But deep inside, everything already had. Because for the first time since Daniel died, I finally understood the difference between being loved and being managed. 2 weeks later, Ethan invited me to dinner at their house in Chicago. Vanessa insisted on hosting an early Christmas gathering before everyone became busy for the holidays. Her text message sounded cheerful. Warm even. She added little snowflake emojis beside the invitation as if nothing in the world had changed. I accepted immediately. Margaret thought it was the right decision. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are still in control. She told me the day before the trip. The drive into the city took nearly 5 hours because of heavy snow near Toledo. By the time I arrived, the Whitmore house glowed softly against the dark December sky. White Christmas lights wrapped around the porch columns. Expensive wreaths hung perfectly centered in every front window. From the outside, it looked like the kind of home featured in holiday magazines. Beautiful, polished, untouched by tension. Vanessa opened the door wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and a smile so practiced it almost impressed me. Eleanor, she said warmly, you made it through the weather. She kissed my cheek lightly before taking my coat. Ethan hugged me tightly beside the staircase. He looked tired. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes now. Dinner is almost ready, Vanessa announced smoothly as if she had rehearsed the sentence before I arrived. The dining room table was decorated with gold candles and crystal glasses. Soft jazz music drifted quietly through hidden ceiling speakers. Everything looked elegant enough to distract from the truth sitting silently beneath it all. Throughout dinner, Vanessa behaved flawlessly. She complimented my scarf, asked about my church friends, refilled my wine before the glass became half empty. Watching her now felt strangely fascinating. I finally understood why manipulation worked so well when wrapped in politeness. Ethan talked about work while Vanessa occasionally touched his arm gently, guiding conversations whenever they drifted too close to finances or family history. Then dessert arrived. Vanilla cheesecake, topped with sugared cranberries. Vanessa smiled while setting plates in front of Us. Daniel always loved Christmas dinners, she said softly. He cared so much about family. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. Yes, I answered calmly. That is why he left recordings. The fork slipped from Ethan's hand and clattered softly against his plate. Vanessa froze for only half a second before recovering. Recordings? She repeated lightly. I reached into my purse slowly and placed the small digital recorder onto the center of the table beside the candles. Nobody spoke. Even the music from the ceiling speakers suddenly seemed too loud. Ethan frowned. Mom, what is this? Something your father made before surgery, I answered quietly. Vanessa's expression remained controlled, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the stem of her wine glass. Barely noticeable, but enough. I pressed play. Static crackled softly before Daniel's voice filled the dining room. Older. Weak. Careful. If changes happen after my death, he said through the speaker, promise me you will review every trust document carefully. Ethan's face lost color immediately. Vanessa reached forward suddenly. This is inappropriate, she said sharply. For the first time since I met her, the warmth disappeared completely from her voice. I looked at her calmly. Is it? Daniel's recording continued. Ethan trusts too easily when people sound confident. Silence settled over the table like snowfall. Ethan stared at Vanessa slowly now. Confused. Hurt. Finally awake. Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You are twisting things completely out of context. I reached into my purse again and placed copies of the forged signatures beside the recorder. Then the bank transfer records beside those. One page at a time. Quietly. Methodically. The same way Daniel used to organize tax documents every April. Ethan looked down at the papers without speaking. I watched realization spread across his face piece by piece. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just devastatingly human. Vanessa opened her mouth twice before any words came out. Ethan, she whispered. I can explain. But he never looked at her. He kept staring at the signatures instead. At the account numbers. At 4 years of lies hidden inside neat paperwork and polite smiles. And for the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt invisible sitting at that table.